You know, it would be just so nice and neat and tidy to have all of our hosts in one single VLAN connected to one single switch. But you and I both know, certainly at this point in our studies and our careers, that is never ever going to happen. This example is a little more real world, and by the way, I would draw this out because this is not a diagram we're going to keep coming back to. We've got the same four hosts we had in the previous discussion, and we've got the same two VLANs, VLAN 1 and VLAN 12, but this time the hosts in VLAN 12, 1 and 2, are connected to different switches, and our two hosts in VLAN 1, host 3 and host 4, are connected to two different switches as well. So we've got to have some kind of working physical connection between the switches, and that's going to be our trunk link. What I've got here in my lab are two switches that are connected via two crossover cables. One organizational tool I want to mention to you, trunks don't require you certainly to use the identically numbered port on each switch. You don't have to connect port 11 on one switch to port 11 on the other switch to have a trunk. The numbers of the ports don't matter. In labs, though, it's a fantastic organizational tool, especially for those of you who do later go after the IE and you've got 10 switches in there and a bunch of cables flying around. It's really nice to look at one trunk link and say, okay, if it's on port 11 on one switch, I know it's connected to port 11 on another. It's just a good habit to get into. Now, for those frames, hit the button there, for those frames to go flawlessly and freely between our switches, we've got to get that trunk established. And sometimes it is the easiest thing in the world. I'm going to be blunt with you here, as I always am. Most of the time, it's the easiest thing in the world because when you physically connect them, usually the trunk will form by itself. You don't even have to do anything except verify it, of course. Now, every once in a while, you need a little fine-tuning to get the job done. And of course, it's a very safe bet that your CCNP switch exam is going to test you on both scenarios. Now, a trunk is a member of all VLANs by default. That is beyond important for you to remember. And it allows traffic then for any and all the VLANs to cross the trunk, which is a good idea. But that includes broadcast traffic, and that's a not so good idea because what we're always interested in doing is limiting the scope of the broadcast. More on that later. Now, I do want to mention one thing here about that cabling. Now, classic theory holds that you need a crossover cable for a switch-to-switch connection, and that's actually what I'm using in this pod. But some Cisco switch models, many of them at this point actually, will allow you to use a different kind of cable, straight through cable. And what you can do is you just connect the two with a straight through cable and the switches auto sense each other. They say, oh, okay, well, there's a switch on the other end of this point-to-point connection, so I need to adjust a little bit and act like I'm a crossover cable. It's not a technical description of what happens, but it is in effect exactly what happens. Now, before we do the verification with show interface trunk, I want to bring the pod up here. Let me move that over just a little bit. And you can see that we have connectivity over the trunk. Host 1 can ping host 2 without a problem. They're in the same VLAN but on different switches. And because of our trunk, that's not an issue. Host 3, no problem at all. Pings host 4. It's in the same VLAN. And there's no problem whatsoever going right across that trunk. Now, let's do a little show VLAN brief here. I'm going to get a little ahead of myself here. Let's get over on one of the switches. That will definitely work better. Now, we've got our accounting VLAN, VLAN 12. We see that port 1 is in it. But do you see a couple of ports that might be missing from this 12-port switch? Fast 011 and 012. They're not here. They're not going to show up in show VLAN brief. Trunk ports don't show up in show VLAN brief because they're a member of all VLANs. So you won't see them here. Where you will see them is in show interface trunk. And here's a handy bit of information, a lot of information actually. We're going to go over just about all of this in this particular section of the course. And then of course the spanning tree information at the bottom we're going to talk about in the very next section. But even if you've never seen this before, let's take a quick look at it. We're not going to go over every topic here, but we've got, there are your ports that are trunking, a mode called desirable. We've got encapsulation of 802.1q. That should sound familiar from your CCNA studies. Status of trunking. Well, if this is a trunk, that's a good thing. And something called the native VLAN 1. Then under that, you've got the VLANs that are allowed on the trunk. Might be coming back to that as well. And then VLANs allowed and active in the management domain. That's really just a fancy way of saying here are the VLANs that are allowed and that we're actually using. And right now that is 1 and 12. Now let's go over to our other switch and run the exact same command. And we see the same categories, if you will, the same headings, port, mode, encapsulation, status, and native VLAN, but things have changed here a little bit. The mode is different. Let's see if I can get all that on one screen. Yeah, there we go. The mode is different. There's an N in front of the encapsulation on switch 2, and then after that everything is fine. The status is trunking and the native VLAN is VLAN 1. So I have a feeling we're going to be revisiting that as well. We took a look at each of the categories there from left to right. And of course, as with any show command, if you run show interface trunk and you don't see anything, that means that you don't have any ports that are trunking. Then we saw the trunking mode each port is using, the encapsulation type, the status of the trunk, pardon me, and then the native VLAN. Again, I did put in here, and I just want to quickly remind you that when you run show VLAN brief, you will not see your trunk ports. You will not see them. So make sure to look. If you're missing some ports in show VLAN brief, always run show interface trunk and see if that's where they are. I bet it is. Now, I did send the pings across. I showed you the results of that. And, you know, everything is fine. Everything's working beautifully. In trunking, again, as we've seen, by default, it can work pretty darn easily because all I did here was connect the two switches with a cable. That was it. I haven't done anything else. I haven't added any configuration or fine-tuned anything. You know, but you know I'm leading up to something, right? You've probably already read it here. As with everything good in networking, there's some overhead involved. Everything we do on a Cisco router or a switch has a cost. And the overhead here involves something we call frame tagging. And that's where the frame has a VLAN ID attached to it by the switch that is sending the frame. And in turn, that VLAN ID is going to be read by the receiving switch, and that switch knows the VLAN ID indicates the destination VLAN, and then it knows, oh, okay, this is what I should do with the frame now. This is who needs to get it. Now, the amount of overhead is really totally dependent on whether ISL or IEEE 802.1q, there's a mouthful, so thankfully we just call it .1q, is being used as the trunking protocol. Now, here's a real-world note for you. Most Cisco switches no longer support ISL. There are some popular home lab switches, including the 2950, that never did. So, you know, ISL on a lot of Cisco switches has been gone for a long time. We know, though, for a certification exam and for the real world, but mostly here, I admit, for the certification exam, we know that if we have two protocols that are doing the same thing, if they're forming trunks and there are similarities and differences, we know that's going to come up on the exam. And on the very next video, we're going to talk about ISL.1q, the similarities and differences, and another trunking protocol that you don't see here on your screen. So I'll see you on the next video, and we'll chat about that.